Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event in the Multi-Faith Climate Crisis Dialogue Series, sponsored by the Vancouver Unitarians and the Multi-Faith Action Society of British Columbia. My name is John Boyle, and I'm a member of the Board of Trustees of the Vancouver Unitarians. We acknowledge that our campus, corner of 49th and Oak in Vancouver, is located on the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam people. We deeply appreciate the wisdom that guided Indigenous stewardship of these lands for millennia before settlement by others, and recognize the damage done to both them and their lands by that settlement. And we are actively committed to working with Indigenous peoples as allies in finding a better way forward to a just and sustainable future for us all. Now, every day, and especially this year in British Columbia, we're reminded that we are in a climate crisis. The purpose of this dialogue series is to support us in finding the individual and collective strength to clearly face the truth of that crisis, in mourning the damage being done to our blue planet, and inspiring ourselves and others to action. Our speakers are drawn from diverse faith and spiritual traditions, including those of Indigenous peoples. They speak to how these traditions and practices and the values they represent help them contend with the climate emergency. In this way, we hope that they will help you and me engage more effectively with the crisis and create a way forward to a sustainable future for ourselves and our families, our communities, our nation, and for the health of our loved ones and our planet. Before turning the evening over to our moderator and speaker, I first want to thank our media sponsor, the TAI, and I'd like to introduce Kathy Merchant for some opening remarks from our co-sponsors, the Multi-Faith Action Society.
Thank you very much, John. Hi, my name is Kathy Merchant. I'm the Vice President of the Multi-Faith Action Society. We are proud to be co-sponsors of this event, and we're very happy that you all are hosting it, so thank you. A Multi-Faith Action Society has been around for 50 years. It's actually the oldest interfaith organization in Canada, and we've been working on the multi-faith calendar for the last 36 years. So this year, the calendar looks like this. Our theme is resilience for 2022. Our calendar has special occasions, holidays, religious festivals, about more than 500 of these from 14 different faith traditions. It also features public holidays, UN special occasions, and certain cultural celebrations. So we live in a multi-faith country. We're part of a community of people from a wide variety of faith traditions, and we're very happy to honor all of these and to learn about them. So if you'd like to get a copy of the calendar, I have a few here, but we also are selling them on our website. I believe the website's available, yes, multifaithcalendar.org. And so just let us know if you're interested. And we just put out a call to artists for our calendar for next year. If anyone is interested in submitting artwork to that website, you can reach us there. So thank you so much again for hosting this event. And I'd like to turn it over now to the moderator and the speaker. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy and John. My name's Olivia. I'm one of the moderators tonight. I want to say hello to everyone joining us online. It's another one of those strange events where I know I'm saying hi to a bunch of people, but I can't see you at all. Hello. So I want to welcome everybody, and those of you who attend UCV Sunday services know that we like to ask everyone to say hi in the YouTube chat, and also to let us know where you're watching from, and give us your own land acknowledgement if you know the nation whose land you are on. I want to thank all of our UCV volunteers and staff for organizing this event. And also, today we get to announce a bunch of our future speakers who've been lined up for the rest of the series. We've got February, March, April, and May up on the slide there. Please join us for those as well.
Hello, everyone. And yes, I must remember to do this. Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Michael Clegg, member of the church, and co-moderating, co-hosting with Olivia this evening. I just want to very briefly, say why this topic. In the consideration for this series, it originates in some of us observing that there is a tremendous wealth of information about climate and climate change these days. It's almost overwhelming. It's the competition between what's evidence and what's not. It swirls around us. And yet there is not necessarily a good deal of discussion about the questions that this dynamic of climate crisis does to us, to our mental health state, to our soul, if you will. How do we cope? Where do we find resilience? How do we contribute? How do we carry forward in terms of contributing constructively and with themes in mind of a just, socially just and sustainable society? That's the origin for this series. We thought we would invite speakers from a variety of faith communities and secular backgrounds to, in fact, share their own perceptions with us this evening. And that's what we are going to be doing.
So we will be hearing from Carmen. She will speak to us for about half an hour, and then there will be the Q&A. For that, we are asking you to submit your questions through the YouTube chat, and we will be posing them. So Michael and I will pose your questions to Carmen. Yvonne and John will be bringing them to us. So when you hear something that you want to dig into deeper in Carmen's talk, feel free to put a question in the YouTube chat.
And now, I was delighted when I phoned Reverend Lansdowne in December that she responded positively to our invitation to contribute to this program series. We thought at the time we were moving, to use the spiritual phrase, enlightenment, where we might actually be able to have a live audience with us. We did in our December launch, but we are not able to this evening. We hope we will be able to resume that, having a degree of live audience as well as online subsequently in the series. But Reverend Lansdowne made it here, and we're delighted because she's coming out of COVID. And thank you so much for carrying on with us. We're certainly glad you're feeling better. Carmen Lansdowne is the Executive Director, First United Community Ministry Society. She joined First United in 2017. She is an ordained minister in the United Church of Canada, and I must interject at this point. We've just learned that she has been nominated as the next moderator of the United Church of Canada. We wish you well. She's also a member of the Heitsuk First Nation. She has served on the executive of the General Council as United Church representative to the executive and central committees of the World Council of Churches. Currently, she sits on the Theology, Interchurch, Interfaith Committee of the National Church. She holds a doctorate from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, speaks, writes, and publishes across North America on issues of Indigenous theology and Indigenous Christian relationships. Reverend Lansdowne, thank you.
All right. Just a quick correction. I'm no longer on the Theology, Interchurch, Interfaith Committee. But I do sit on the board of the Sandy Soto Spiritual Center, which is the United Church Theological Training School for Indigenous students in Canada. And I last year joined the board of the Vancouver Foundation here in Vancouver. So, and I'm not nominated as the moderator, but a candidate for moderator. So there will be more nominations hopefully coming this spring and an election in July. Good evening, everyone. It's my very deep privilege to join you here in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of Musqueam. Deep gratitude to the Vancouver Unitarians for postponing this for 2 weeks so that I could come and speak safely after our family was hit with a very mild, I'm grateful to say, case of the Omicron virus of COVID-19. I live and work in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, the Squamish-Niicum and Hunkaminam-speaking peoples. And when I say traditional, what I mean by that is that these are the lands that were traditionally used by the peoples who were here prior to European arrival. When I say ancestral, I mean that to specifically tie the traditional use of this land to the lineage of Indigenous lives who have been here since time immemorial. And when I say unceded, I mean that these lands have never been ceded to the Canadian state under any Western common law. And I also want to acknowledge that the reason why I say Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh in that order is because the three host nations decided together that when acknowledging their overlap of territories publicly, that they wanted to do that in alphabetical order. And as part of my practice of territorial acknowledgements, I've started to sort of explain why I use the words that I use. My traditional name in Heestruchlaa is Gagwegilauk, which means dearest or dear one. And my traditional name in Kwakwala is Kwisalach, which means woman who travels far. As Michael said, I'm a member of the Heiltsuk First Nation and also an ordained minister in the United Church of Canada. I also want to acknowledge, through my decision to wear my orange t-shirt and my orange earrings for tonight's lecture, the additional confirmation of 93 more unmarked graves at the former site of St. Joseph's Mission in Williams Lake. And this brings the number somewhere between 6,500 and 7,000 human remains that have been discovered or recorded since different First Nations and landowners started investigating and looking for them. And it's a bit of a testament to the fact that that's just become normalized, that it's hard to find the cumulative total anywhere, even with the prevalence of social media. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that my heart goes out to the people of Williams Lake First Nation and the descendants of all whose family attended St. Joseph's. The reason I spend so much time in my opening talking about the land acknowledgement and the continued confirmation of those additional bodies discovered across the sites of different residential schools and missions across this country is not just because I'm an Indigenous woman, but this historical and present reality is so deeply connected to our relationship with the whole of the created order. How we treat each other, not as humans necessarily, but how our human created systems impact the real bodies of each other, is deeply related to our ability to interact with the earth in healthy and balanced ways, or unhealthy and unbalanced ways. It's sort of like that old saying that you can't love somebody until you really love yourself. Our inability to care for human beings is deeply related to our inability to care for the whole of God's creation. I have to say that also a bit of an admission, on top of a busy day job and having recently recovered from COVID, I'm grateful that I was able to draw a lot on sermons I'd previously written to answer the questions for reflection that you had given me. So especially if you're from the United Church and you're watching tonight, I appreciate your grace in letting me use or reuse some of my stories and thoughts to engage in this dialogue tonight. It's just the way the cookie crumbled this way around, and I have to say, through my work over the years with the World Council of Churches, I know for a fact I heard Desmond Tutu recycle parts of the same speech at least 3 or 4 times, so I feel like I'm in pretty good company. In reflecting on the questions that the moderating panel asked me to consider in preparing for tonight's lecture, the question that jumped out to me first was, is there any aspect of your religious or spiritual tradition that has been harmful in terms of addressing the climate crisis? While I know there are many good Christians, and indeed good Christian climate activists, to name some local Saskatchewan or Manitoba and West well-known ones would be Christine Boyle, Laurel Dykstra, Barry Morris, Jim and Eva Manley, the Gage family in Victoria, Steve Heinrichs. I think that my religious and spiritual tradition has been largely to blame for the climate crisis. Maybe not the church or Christianity itself, but the ways in which Christianity and Western worldviews became so enmeshed that to exist within a world that is the product of the European Enlightenment, that has resulted in this currently bastardized, extractivist form of late-stage capitalism, is deeply informed by the historical practice of Christianity and vice versa. It's what my fellow Indigenous theologian Tink Tinker from the Osage Nation in the US refers to as Euro-Christianity. The Western world, as defined by socio-religious history and structural dominance of its political and economic systems, is Euro-Christian. For all the ways that they are different, Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and Australia can also be considered Euro-Christian in terms of their overall worldviews and philosophies. I'm happy during the discussion period to go into my views on our political and social and economic realities that currently dictate our inaction on climate and their roots in the Euro-Christian worldview, but I also think that I'm largely preaching to the choir on that somewhat. So the second question that your group posed to me that really resonated was this one. How do your faith or spiritual traditions or values address climate justice, particularly regarding the disparities between the global north and the south? And to answer this question, I can't just rely on Christian scripture or Christian theology, but what is specific to me as an Indigenous Christian. I want to talk about my history in the church, the beautiful, fraught, racist, loving, striving, aspirational, fallible United Church of Canada that I'm called to serve. In so many ways, this church demonstrates the variety and diversity that makes up Canada as a whole, in all the good and all the painful ways. My history with this church starts over 100 years ago. I come from the house of Wigwith-Bawakas. Currently, our hereditary chief is Harvey Humchit. My great-great-grandfather, Wigwith-Bawakas, known in the accounts of Canadian history as Chief Humsit. Many of our communities were first introduced to the church through the missionary work of Thomas Crosby. Crosby's account of his work as a Methodist missionary in the Central Coast region was published in 1914, the year he died. Entitled Up and Down the North Pacific Coast by Canoe and Mission Ship, in his 400-page account, he talks about Bella Bella and the history of the church there. The story I grew up hearing in my family was different, as was the timing. Likely, Crosby's chronology is more accurate, but the reasoning behind why I understood that we converted to Christianity and what Crosby writes was the smallpox epidemic. An epidemic that was happening during the period that he was writing about, but that he never explicitly acknowledged in any of his writing. It's believed that when Fort McLaughlin was established in the early 1830s, that there were between 15,000 and 35,000 Haistuk peoples in the central coast of BC. By 1904, there were less than 500 of us. So in the triumphant celebration of his success of the mission, there's no acknowledgement of the systemic coercion of a health pandemic that changed the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the missionary preachers, doctors, and teachers who capitalized on the shocks of the pandemic by winning souls for Jesus. But the other part not told in his story is why my great-great-grandfather and my great-grandfather converted to Christianity, at least as I understand it from my family's telling. We never had a concept of forgiveness before, and Christianity held that. In fact, what I understand from my aunties and grannies and my mother is that Chief Humsit and other hereditary chiefs engaged in a weeks-long Bible study before closing their own village sites and moving to the fort. What I've been told was that they saw nothing in the Bible that was in conflict with our traditional ways of life, and that forgiveness was a new concept that would change the future for our people. Then the Great War happened. Apparently, my great-grandfather confronted the church leadership and questioned why they were going to war when we were called by the gospel to forgive, and asserted in no uncertain terms that white people were crazy, not following the answers that were already in their own book. It was never an easy or an unnuanced start, and of course, it got more complicated from there, with residential schools, legally institutionalized racism that persists despite generations of amendments to the Indian Act. So, enter me, Carmen Lansdowne, born in Alert Bay in September of 1975 to Bruce and Dolly Lansdowne, who were married at First United Church, where I now serve. I could talk for hours about my mom's involvement in the church and specifically her role in the national consultations on Native ministries and on becoming the first director of BC Native Ministries for the United Church, but I won't, otherwise we will be here until tomorrow. What I will say is that because of her work and because of her history, I grew up understanding systemic injustice and being able to articulate, or to identify and articulate specifically classism, racism, sexism, and the role that the church could aspire to in addressing those isms. She believed then, as we both do now, that the gospel called us to a movement of liberation, and that the church has a moral obligation to, 1, seek reconciliation and restitution for past harms, and 2, to still continue to aspire to the coming of God's kingdom on earth. Her work, and thus my life, was deeply informed by the liberation theology movement that was taking shape in Latin America. Informed by the educational philosopher Paulo Freire from Brazil, the liberation theologians made arguments for liberation from oppression, in their case mainly economic oppression, and for the poorest of the world, through a process called conscientization. Freire believed that there is no such thing as a neutral educational process. Education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate the integration of generations into the logic of the present system and bring conformity to it, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically with their reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. The hard thing and the beautiful thing about liberation and the process of conscientization is that the burden of proving the injustice exists and developing a way forward out of injustice falls on the oppressed. That means, as Indigenous peoples and as the Indigenous church, it's our job to come together to liberate ourselves from centuries of colonialist thinking, to educate ourselves out of our own experience, our own cultures and languages and traditions, our own experiences of traditional spiritualities, and our experiences of Christianity, and to teach the church what we all must do to be liberated from the oppressions of the past and our present. And that's my dream for our faith tradition. A few years ago, I was asked to write a piece for the United Church on intercultural theology and the United Church's A New Creed. You know that piece, you've probably heard it even in the Unitarian tradition, where we say in worship, we are not alone, we live in God's world, who has created and is creating, who has come in Jesus, the Word made flesh. And when it gets down to the part about who we're called to be as the church, it says, we are called to be the church, to celebrate God's presence, to live with respect in creation, to love and serve others, to seek justice and resist evil, to proclaim Jesus crucified and risen, our judge and our hope. I chose to write about the call to resist evil precisely because I believe what the popular TV psychologist Dr. Phil says, you cannot heal or change what you don't acknowledge. How should we seek injustice if we can't name the injustice? When we think about the climate emergency and all the myriad forms of injustice that have resulted in our current context, it's really easy to stay in a place of anger and fear. The book of Genesis has one of the first instances in the Christian canon and the Hebrew scriptures that I will not profess to say anything about from a Jewish perspective, but the scripture says, God appeared to humanity telling us to fear not. Abraham was worried about his legacy and what his life would mean if his only heir was Ishmael. God promises Abraham if he has faith, he'll have descendants as numerous as the stars. So often the Bible addresses our fears and we are told by God or some other divine messenger to be not afraid or fear not. I've never personally checked to see if it's true, so let's assume it's an urban legend, but legend has it that the Bible instructs us to fear not 365 times. That's one day for each day of the calendar year. 2 years into a global pandemic and seemingly every other kind of plague and environmental catastrophe the universe can throw at us, there is so much fear. And like Abraham, who yearned with Sarah for family and the intimate community that it brings, most of us are acutely aware, both that yearning to be close to those outside of our immediate household, as well as plagued by some undercurrent of existential dread. Partway through my first theological degree, I did some therapy and discernment over whether or not I would ever get married and have children. It wasn't that I struggled with the idea of having children, but approaching 30, I thought, I'm single. I don't want to wake up one day at 40 and still be single and have some kind of breakdown because it didn't work out for me. So I worked really hard at addressing the assumptions that I had about the having it allness that second wave feminism and was sort of breeding into children of the 70s and 80s like me and my peers. We were taught to believe that, of course, we could get educations, have successful and meaningful professional careers, soaring to heights because the women who had come before us crashed through several glass ceilings in the decades prior to our empowered arrival in this world. I reflected about the ecumenical faith lessons that I was learning from being involved with the World Council of Churches. Unlike the Roman Catholic Church, which forbade marriage and required celibacy, originally to protect the church's real property and assets, because under Roman law, wives and children had claim to the assets of the church because the church and the priests were considered to be one and the same, and that gets into a whole thing about tax and church and money and power that we don't want to get into. But the Oriental and the Eastern Orthodox traditions have two streams of ordered ministry. Ordinands go through a discernment process of whether they want to serve a parish, in which case they can get married and have families. They're supposed to get married before ordination. But if they'd rather serve the wider church, they choose a life of celibacy and marriage to the church. Because the devotion to postgraduate theological study, administration of the church, and the travel and the ecumenical dialogue requires so much of those in leadership that they can't serve either their families or the church in ways that preserves their own well-being. At that point in my own life, it certainly seemed like I might be making a career for myself in that latter form of ministry, and so I simply let go of my attachment to getting married and having kids. It's not that I became opposed to it, obviously, because I got married and I had kids. It's just I became open to it not happening, or to it happening. And at any rate, during that time of intense discernment, I remember having a conversation with my mother about being open to not having children. And she asked me why, and I shared some of my thoughts with her. And in addition, I said the more I became aware of and educated about climate change, I worried about what kind of future I would be leaving to my children. And maybe it was better if I didn't contribute to the further populating of this earth. This deeply offended my mother, especially because at that point I already had a nephew, and she did not want to talk about that reality for him. In hindsight, I can see how it seemed like judgment of my brother and his decision to have a family, but I didn't intend it that way. Fast forward 15 to 20 years later to September 2020, where we had just lived through summers with windows closed and an air purifier humming in the background on what should have been a glorious end of summer day. But for the 5th straight day in a row, Vancouver had the worst air quality in the world. In the world. Our children were back at school, and it wasn't ideal for them to be back in classrooms that were impacted so severely due to COVID-19, and they were trapped inside because the air quality was so bad outside, but they shouldn't have been inside because of the pandemic. A lawyer we used for some of First United's business said to me one day he wondered if we were in Egypt and God was sitting up there trying to decide which plague or famine to throw at us next. And it does feel more and more every year during the fires when we get this eerie orange sun in the sky that like all of the scorched earth dystopian literature and film predictions are coming true. If I am 100% honest, I have more than a little undercurrent of existential dread on the go at any given moment. And like most somewhat repressed North American types, I'm doing my very best to throw myself into work, parenting, exercise, and a limited social life, and ignoring that deep, deep fear that is aching in my bones about what the actual heck is happening to our world. This past winter, preparing to preach at a congregation on the North Shore, I reflected several times on that scripture passage and Abraham and Sarah's angst over not being able to conceive. And a judgy part of me was like, really? That's it? That's all you got? Lightweights. And I'm not saying that to minimize the experience of yearning for family or the very deep and real pain faced by couples and people who cannot conceive. But over the last 2 years, where the hits just keep on coming to our bodies and our psyches and our planet, you have to admit even just a little that Abraham and Sarah had no idea. Mostly, I just walk around and think God's yelling at us to wake up. These are deep and meaningful wake-up calls to us that we are deeply, deeply out of balance with the world around us. COVID-19 came from the wet markets where our rampant consumption of meat allows for the thriving of disease. Close interactions with wild animals have caused numerous disease outbreaks in humans, including Ebola, HIV, and now COVID-19. There was no doubt in September 2020, if you looked at the forest fire map of the United States, you could see that from Wyoming to Texas and everything west was on fire. And I read an old opinion piece in the Huffington Post, and because the title had caught my attention. The Bible says, "Fear not, but I'm scared shitless sometimes." You? I'm not gonna lie, I saw that title and I thought, yep, I'm right there with you, sister. That author wrote, "Before 8 a.m. this morning, I was feeling overwhelmed," which is a fancy word for fear. Saying I'm overwhelmed makes me sound busy and sophisticated, but what I really want to do is crawl under my covers and hide. And yet, God promised Abraham and Noah and David and Ruth, and the prophets foretold, and Jesus promised us, if we listen to the world that God is calling us to, the world that God is calling us to make real here on earth, we need not be afraid. And in that, I can say I feel in my embattled heart, and the armor around it starts to soften, to let in that little bit of hope and faith that I don't have to resign to an apocalyptic future for my descendants. Given what we know in the 21st century about the fragile balance between large centers of human population and the ability of the biosphere to remain in balance, I'm not sure that descendants that number into the stars is what anyone aspires to anymore. But we can aspire to family and to community. And the truth is, this collective wake-up call that we are facing together, and let's face it, if we really are moving rapidly from talking about climate change to a climate emergency to a climate apocalypse, and that's a wake-up call if I've ever heard one, this wake-up call requires all of us, communities coming together in all of their diversity and working together to change the systems that are not only hurting the most marginalized, but now are so out of balance, they're starting to hurt us all. If we really are to yearn for a new creation and a new community, the time is now to not fear, but to start building communities of resilience that will act for collective change so that we can indeed have the world that God dreams for us, which is to have life and to have life in abundance. It probably didn't seem that way to Abraham and Sarah. Into their 90s, God's promise had not come to fruition until they were reminded to have faith, and then it did. And they had a child. And the story of promise and a new creation and a new community came to life for them. And then there's this vivid imagery in the book of Daniel, and this fiery God who is sitting on a throne of fire, fire issuing from him, and the book of judgment being opened. And from this fiery court, there is this foreshadowing of the human one who comes in on the clouds to take his place at the right hand of God to rule with dominion, glory, and kingship over all the peoples. I'm Cradle United Church. Normally, fire and brimstone is not my thing. But after living through the past 2 years, maybe there's a few things to pay attention to. I'm not saying that I think that God caused the pandemic or the heat dome or the forest fires or the flooding. But the way that the apocalyptic and the prophetic texts work is they use imagery that cause us to blend visceral memories with predictions for the future. And usually a future that predicts dire consequences if we don't take a different path or a different course of action. And normally, I'm not down with a kind of portrayal of Jesus as a king with dominion over us. I think in the United Church, at least, we're much more likely to think of Jesus as a type of benevolent brother, teacher, friend, shepherd, healer type. But when I think about the world that we are living in, the times that we are living through, maybe it's time for a little fire and brimstone. I wasn't born or raised in Bella Bella. I did spend a good chunk of my childhood in Alert Bay, where I was born, in the traditional territories of the Namgis, part of the Kwakwaka'wakw peoples. Kwakwaka'wakw culture and language is very similar to Heiltsuk. Both our cultures were based on the potlatch system, a cultural, economic, and political system where we would spend months and years gathering food and goods, inviting everyone to our village from as far away as Alaska and Washington and Oregon. And our power and our prestige came from giving away everything that we had. The more you could afford to take care of other people, the more powerful you were. I don't want to romanticize our culture. We had perpetual cycles of vicious warfare, which is why my great-grandfather was so excited about forgiveness, and also slavery was a part of our tradition. But the ideas that we had that were in common with most other Indigenous peoples were that the world was a place of abundance, and you only took what you needed, and that the only reason for taking more was to take care of others. That's part of what was so threatening and foreign to the Euro-Christian settlers who came to colonize Canada, that they put an end to the potlatch, making it illegal to practice. When I left work on the first Friday afternoon of the first day of gas restrictions in November, I briefly saw a notification on my phone from Twitter that the province was asking people to ration their use of gas and to reserve it for essential use. But by the time I picked up my kid and her friend from rock climbing and drove them back up to Lynn Valley, every gas station had lineups. I usually only get gas on days I get paid. It makes me less cranky about the cost of gas. I got paid that Friday, and I had about 1/8 of a tank of gas left. So I actually needed gas. And those cultural roots about status and power coming from the ability to provide for others over sustained periods of time runs deep in me. And I was raised in the modern capitalist system that we all live in, which really manufactures consumption and teaches us that we're in competition for scarce resources, and we always need more and take care of ourselves first. I spent all of that first Friday night in deep internal struggle over whether or not to go get my 30 liters of gas, or if I should just let my tank sit empty and make do with other modes of transportation. I usually bring our dog to work with me in the downtown east side, but I could leave her at home with my husband and take the bus. I texted my 2 colleagues who also live on the North Shore, and we decided that we would try to carpool. My husband also offered to walk the kids to school instead of the normal 1-kilometer drive so that I could take his plug-in electric vehicle. In the end, I decided to go and get my 30 liters of gas just to be safe, but also to use all of those other options at my disposal. I got my gas at the Petrocan closest to my house, and I was pleased to see that other cars at the pump were following the honor system and taking only 30 liters, and regular gas was all that was left, which is okay because that's what I use. I left to run an errand, and the Esso station down the street from us was right out of gas, completely out. I came home to a social media post by one of our staff that she'd just been to Superstore and the shelves were virtually empty. I remembered back to 2020 and the start of the pandemic. At our house, we didn't panic shop, and we had enough. Sometimes we had to change our plans, but we managed to get the things that we needed, even the times that we were quarantined in our home. But that drive to think of the world as being a place of scarcity is so strong in our culture, in the wider Euro-Christian culture, that when the chips are down, we're taught, not even explicitly, but there's almost a drive bred into us to put ourselves first, to take care of our own, and to let others worry about themselves. And despite that, the world can still be a place of immense beauty and generosity. When I saw the news about the Gurdwara that was preparing thousands of meals and had hired private helicopters to lift them into the Fraser Valley for the victims of the flooding, I was brought to tears. There is so much beauty and so much struggle in this world of ours, and we are standing at some pretty serious forks in the road in terms of our potential to survive and to thrive. Despite that generosity and beauty, the truth is, if we were living more balanced lives, lives where we centered community and got our power and prestige from our ability to care for others and not ourselves, we might not find ourselves in constant crisis. The reality is that the need for charity is created out of our exploitation of people and the planet. And a lot, not all, but a lot of the philanthropic money that goes to charities is derived from those very systems that are exploiting people and the planet. What would the world look like if we could imagine an outcome where we didn't need charity? I work in the downtown east side, and we tend to look at the people in the downtown east side as if they have had some kind of individual moral failure. But a lot of the traumas that they're medicating with drugs and alcohol, or the mental illnesses that they suffer, are from systemic oppression. One of the Niebuhr brothers said once that it has always been the orientation of the privileged classes to hold people down to the ground with a boot on their throats, and then to judge them for their failure to access the things that they need to survive. So what is the answer? I'm not sure, but in a time of converging crises, I find that I'm less and less off-put by that fire and brimstone image of God. We are called to radically reorient our lives. And if we want to survive, and especially if we want to thrive as humans, we need to find a way to live better in balance with each other and with creation. If in the United Church, my tradition, we want to think of Jesus as a benevolent brother, teacher, friend, shepherd, healer type, then maybe one Sunday a year, which is Reign of Christ Sunday, it's good to remember that image of Jesus as a ruler of us all, to remind us that the world he envisioned for us was based on justice, mercy, love, and care of creation. Because we so often fall so short of that dream he had for us where we were all liberated. I have a friend that I met through the World Council of Churches who is a Quaker from the East Coast, and when I talked about us, she and I being Christian, she said, "Oh, I'm not a Christian, but I hope to be one day." That's so true of all of us on this fallible human journey of faith. Abraham and Sarah had a new creation. And I deeply believe, and this is why I can remain Indigenous and Christian, that it can happen for us too. When I let go of the fear, when I breathe through that deep, deep fear that I don't acknowledge as a way of protecting my babies, when I can remain calm and think about what's the next right thing to do, I still see the beauty in life. I see the amazing communities of activists, companies, neighborhoods, families, politicians, and Indigenous communities who are calling us into a new way of being. Sometimes gently, sometimes very aggressively, but prophesying in their own brilliant ways that a new world is possible,
reminding us that God's kingdom can happen here on earth, but it requires us to repent, to stop what we are doing and to turn around. In Celtic territory, we've stopped talking about reconciliation and reclaimed one of our traditional words, which is heisistut, which means to turn around, to go back and to make things right. It's very similar to this concept of repentance. And I think back to my forebears, and no wonder they said there was nothing in the Bible that was inconsistent with our way of life. If anything, this pandemic has shown us that the world won't end because the rat race slowed down. That while there is economic disruption, that maybe the disruption also shows possibility. That we don't have to maintain the status quo for fear of what might happen when we don't. Because now we know. However imperfectly we did it, we know that we can take care of each other. We know that we can pivot, and more quickly than we ever thought. And that in itself is the start of a new creation. My hope for us, when wherever I am, I look outside, if it's minus 15 like it was last month, or it's smoky skies that seem perennial in our summers now, what another colleague described as nuclear winter, I think we can still have this. Maybe our descendants shouldn't number among the stars, but the world and our innovation and our commitment to life sure can still make the possibilities limitless. And today I choose life instead of fear. I choose faith instead of fear. And I trust that the God who assured Abraham that he would leave a legacy is the God that will bring to fruition the new creation and the community that we so desperately seek. May it be so.
If only you could hear all the other audience clapping as well here. Thank you so much for that, Reverend Lansdowne. It touched many, many points. As you spoke to many of the advanced questions that we gave you, but Olivia, just while others are getting prepared to send them in online, why don't you start if there's some?
Sure, yeah. What I was thinking of all throughout what you were saying was about that need to care for ourselves and also for what you as a Christian might call all of God's creation, what I as a Unitarian might call our seventh principle, the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. But there's this idea that, care first. What I wanted to ask about was when the selfish, Eurocentric, capitalist idea comes within us of like, no, I have to protect me. How do you override that and choose care first when you don't know if your neighbor will? In the past, 30 years, certain privileged nations like ours have insulated themselves more and more from climate change. It's getting harder, but we're still doing it. How do we choose, instead of insulating ourselves, to be kind when we don't know if people will be kind to us?
And that's a good question. I think so much of what I learned over the last 20 years and sort of my own faith journey also ties into some of the principles of recovery and like 12-step programs and other ones. But there was a phrase in there I used that people say often in recovery circles around just do the next right thing, right? And for those of us who have struggled with addiction or alcoholism or mental illness, it's we have to learn really explicitly to like separate our trauma from what I can control, which is my own behavior, and what I can't control, which is the behavior of other people. And I think that people being brave enough to say, no, I actually don't do it that way anymore, is part of what inspires other people to believe that they can make the change, right? Like it's the best parts of faith traditions when we avoid proselytization and like trying to like convert people to a particular religious tradition, but instead practice like true evangelism, which is the sharing of the good news of our faith traditions. It's like attraction rather than promotion, which is a principle of AA. So, I mean, I guess it's less about keeping up with the Joneses or like worrying about what my neighbors think, and just think for me, like today, what can I do? What's the next right thing for me to do? And then the other piece is from Indigenous traditions, and specifically in, some of the potlatch traditions, there's this idea of living up to your name, right? Like that there's an integrity in, you have to earn the right for your name to continue to be high ranking, and there's obligations that go along with status in our societies. And so, whether that's explicit in my life, I think that there's truth in that for me as an Umaks living outside of my traditional terry, but in the city, of like, taking on the role of providing for others in the best way I know how, which is through the structures of the United Church, to provide for people, is what I'm able to do right now. And I just, I can't do everything. And I'm learning more and more, for my own self, that I have to take care of myself physically, like sleep and not eat donuts every day, and like quit smoking a long time ago, things like that. But not in terms of like my physical security, like my physical or economic security. Like my kids asked me one day what I would do if I won. We went on vacation to California in September of 2019 when the Powerball was like $335 million or something. And so we had this conversation about, what would you do if you won the Powerball? And I said, well, I would never win the Powerball because I don't gamble. But your dad sometimes buys lottery tickets. And they said, okay, you make all the money decisions, so what would you do if Dad won the Powerball? And it's true, I have all the keys in our household. And I said, well, I'd probably make a really big contribution to First United Church because we have to build this $70 million building, and I'd probably just pay for that so we could build whatever I wanted. And I would pay off my student loan, and I would buy us a house in Lynn Valley so we wouldn't have to move again. And then, I'd probably put my money in the bank. And they said, why would you put it in the bank? And Gabriel goes, well, you buy a Cybertruck, right? And I was like, no, I wouldn't buy a Cybertruck. And he's like, but Cybertrucks are cool and they're electric. And I was like, but I don't need a Cybertruck. I don't need a new car. He's like, you'd still keep driving your Passat? I'm like, yes, until, like, it doesn't matter how many electric cars are made, like, until my car is no longer useful, there's no amount of driving an electric car can offset the fact that this other gas car still exists in the world. And so we had this really interesting conversation. And then we had a conversation about investments. And my daughter was like, wait, so you put your money in the bank, and then your money makes more money, but it also makes money at the expense of the people who are working for the companies, and they're making less money. And I'm like, yes. And she's like, that's really, really terrible. I said, yeah. She goes, and we'd been having this big conversation about how much she hated math, and she said, when I grow up, that's the problem I want to fix. I want to fix the system that makes rich people get richer and poor people get poorer. And I said, I 100% think you should do it. And you can do it, you can figure it out, but you have to be really good at math. So I went on a big tangent there, but it's the end of the day. I mean, now in hindsight, like, the more I think about monetary policy reform and the really, really systemic ways that the current system supports all of the economic injustice in the world, like, I don't know that I put my money in investments. I don't know what I'd do with it, but it's a good thing I'm never going to win the Powerball because I don't gamble.
Well, thank you. I want to build on that a little bit, if I may, and link it back to our first speaker, Seth Klein. But the link is that in this conversation we're having just now, I believe, is the question of trust. How do I know if I give up something that someone else is going to give up something as well? How do I know that a policy I support will be of general benefit and not at the expense of other people, particularly those who are disadvantaged? So that suggests that as we try to think this through, that's kind of a key criteria in which we measure action, political action, other forms of government action. And I'll have a follow-up with Kath, but would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think trust is huge. Spoiler alert, I'm a recovering alcoholic and drug addict. And so when, over 20 years ago, when I got sober, one of the things that happened in my life was the only thing I could do was be honest about the fact that I didn't even know if I was an alcoholic. I just knew that I was lying to my family a lot, and that didn't feel good, and I promised I wouldn't lie to them anymore. And my mom came home one day and she said, I'm so tired of not trusting you. I'm making a decision that from today, I'm gonna start acting as if I trust you. And it's up to you to become trustworthy. And, you know, it's just like in all the romantic comedies. Like if you close your heart off because you might get hurt, you don't open yourself to the possibility that you might not get hurt. And it's a huge paradigm shift to think about what we all could have to give up in order for us to have more. And I don't think that any policy anywhere is going to protect the most marginalized, because it never could. You would have to have the policy makers step aside and design policies for the people who are in the most marginalized position. Because there's no way, no matter how much, even me as an Indigenous, identifies by woman, I still have economic security. I still have a very high level of education. And when I think about what I could suggest that could address the needs of like subsistence, homeless, like subsistence sex workers, street, like homeless, Indigenous women living with severe mental illness and drug addiction, I could never imagine the policies that are going to liberate her without her input. And unless we design policies that, like, there's this weird thing about, like, well, we're like, all of our policies are designed to, like, catch the biggest pool in the middle. And then we're shocked that there's, like, people under that level that fall through the cracks. The cracks were built above them. And I don't have faith in the current political system that we can design policies that work to catch the most marginalized, because they're not designed to. They're designed to do the very least possible, like to achieve whatever compromise is most politically palatable, as opposed to understanding that if I design a policy that works for that sex worker, street homeless, drug addicted Indigenous woman on the street, it's also going to catch me. It's also going to catch you.
I just add to that, Donald McPherson, the former city drug policy coordinator, said, unless you start with those who are most ill, you're not going to change anything. Over to you. You've got a question.
Yes, I do. I have a question from the YouTube chat. As a leader of a relatively mobilized faith group, what do we need to do to see more action from multi-faith communities on climate?
I don't know. I feel like there is already so much good work that is happening in multi-faith leadership on climate. I'm thinking back to 15 years ago with Desmond Tutu and Sally McFaig and the Dalai Lama, and there is strong leadership at the highest levels globally across multiple faith traditions on climate, and especially in countries that are less insulated from the impacts of the climate emergency than we are in Canada. Marty Tyndall, one of our former moderators, was really strong on climate and has continued to go to climate talks. But I think that the failing of those of us who care about the climate, and Seth has some really good points in his book, and I think he's very aligned with Mariana Mazzucato, who's currently the economic advisor on the BC Restart Plan. She's an Italian economist that works at the University College of London, and she wrote a book called Mission Economy, a moonshot guide to transforming capitalism or something. And she says, and I think Seth says in far more detail, that we have to set the outcome that we want to achieve and work towards that, instead of talking like it's a problem that we have to solve. In my book club, there's a former city councilor, and when we read Mariana's book, she was like, when I was on city council, this shows the difference between the great strides we made in becoming a greener city versus our failure to address homelessness in Vancouver, because we set the green city targets as an objective we wanted to achieve, and we set the homelessness targets as a problem we had to solve. And when you think about something as a problem, you're automatically constraining yourself to a box of prescribed solutions that are already within your realm of possibility, and you're not as innovative or creative, and you're not coming from a human-centered design approach where you're saying how do I really address the deepest core need of this issue? And I think where we all fail is we fail in inspiring each other, right? It's okay, I can't go to another talk on climate change. I'm just going to get depressed, and it's going to be really horrible. One of the organizations I admire the most in the United States is the Solutions Project, right? They believe they're promoting this idea that the transition to 100% renewable energy in the United States.
So is that Al Gore?
Nope. No. It's it was founded by Mark Ruffalo and a scientist and some venture capitalist or something.
Yeah.
And Gloria Watson's currently the CEO. She's a Black woman, but they are promoting this campaign called the 100% campaign, and it's around getting states and local governments and now the federal government to make commitments to move towards 100% renewable energy in the United States. But the way that they do it is by finding the local climate leaders who are experiencing environmental racism and grant making to them, and then lifting up their success as an inspiration to everybody else. And their model is really working. And I think that in the faith community, there's so many really amazing things that different traditions are doing that do have a positive impact on the planet. And I feel like if we told those success stories to each other more, that could be helpful.
Thank you. I've got a religion and political science question that's come up from our viewers. Marx called religion the opium of the people. Mm-hmm. You've probably heard that.
Yeah.
Is religious hope an illusion to keep us from worrying about the world crises?
I don't know enough about Marx to set that in context, but I do know enough about human nature to know that worrying about the world crises can be just as immobilizing as being delusional that there isn't one. You just have to look at anybody who suffers from depression or anxiety at the micro level. I do know that we're in a place of hopeful curiosity. Our brains work better. The Institute for Creative Leadership has this really great 3-minute YouTube illustration where they talk about being above the line or below the line, and it's about brain science. And so they talk about how when you're in your limbic system and you're reacting to things and you feel you're perceiving some kind of threat, like most of our threats in today's society in North America, for those of us that are stably housed and have stable income, most of our threats are social or political, right? They're not actual like threats to our bodies. On the there's lots of threats to our bodies still, and feel like I'm discounting domestic violence, which I'm not. But we live in a state of like reaction to those threats as if there's like a tiger chasing us, right? And when we're in that space, like the way that our limbic systems work is you don't actually think about how your body or your reactions are taking place in the world. It's like it skips from trigger of like whatever the circumstance is to your body's reaction to it. There's no brain action that goes into it. It's just like your lizard brain. And then when you're in this place of like openness and curiosity and engaging your prefrontal cortex, and you're thinking about things and you're able to use your executive function to like analyze a situation and make decisions, so often I think we stay in this place of like reactivity and like threat, and we actually are not able physically, and like the brain science proves this, we're not able to stay in a place of innovation and playfulness and creativity. And if what we need to do is do things differently, like our limbic system reaction is just like to do what we always did, right? It's like I'm going to do the thing that I know to protect myself from this threat. So I don't know what role, religion's a double-edged sword. I don't know a single religious tradition that hasn't participated in really gross genocidal, like human rights violations, and that hasn't equally been life-giving and participating in that new creation for someone somewhere. And I think that prayerful discernment or thoughtful consideration, critical thinking, all require us to stay in that place of openness and creativity in our brains. And, as long as you're aware of whether or not you're above the line in that place of openness and creativity or below the line in that place of like reacting to threat, it doesn't matter if you're religious or not.
Another one that speaks directly to what you were saying earlier, Dr. Carmen, how do you see the role of forgiveness in dealing with the corporate elite who continue to act in ways that are worsening the climate crisis? I know I've fantasized about fire and brimstone specifically for those people.
Okay, so this gets back to monetary policy, and also, I don't know how true it is. I'm not like a huge biblical scholar. In fact, most of the time I avoid the Bible because I think it's dangerous, because you can pick any scripture and like manipulate it to buttress whatever argument you want to make. And the reason why I like being a theologian over like a biblical scholar, and no disrespect to biblical scholars, but for me it's not my jam, is that I look for the message that's consistent across all those pages. Right? I don't care what one particular passage says, but the thing that says across all those pages. So anyway, I heard this story once by some kind of historical biblical scholar that when Jesus said we turn the other cheek, if you analyze that in the context of like the historical cultural customs of the time, you could only strike somebody like one way on one side with one side of your hand across the face. And so when you turned the other cheek, it wasn't an invitation to hit you again. It was actually making it like really awkward for them to strike you in a way that was culturally appropriate. And so it was like a defensive measure. And I think I can be you know, my mom and I were having a conversation this morning about Jeff Bezos and the fact the guy makes $1 million every 8 minutes. And yeah, I can get upset about that. It makes my blood boil. And I sure as heck have to like look at how much I order stuff at work and at home from Amazon. Like I still do it. So, you know, I think this is where like the monetary policy reform piece is really important, because that's the like really high level stuff that lets those transnational companies do or not do those things, right? Like there are companies that break the law and get fined internationally, but also like for the most part, I think they do what they're allowed to do. And we give away so much of our political power by saying, like, you know, by allowing lobbyists to influence our politicians more than us influencing our politicians. And we don't ask for what we need. Like in Seth's book, you know, he's talking about, I'll out her because she's in the book, is Joyce Murray saying, well, like, okay, you and I are on the same page, Seth, but like the people, they're not there yet. Like, who do you know on the west side of Vancouver that's not there yet on climate policy reform? Nobody. Like, how could she think that? But like, who's actually taking the time to go to Joyce Murray and say, you're my MP, this is the #1 issue for me, because I bet you it's in the top 3 for most people who live on the world. Yeah, okay, John's going. He goes and talks to Joyce. But like, you're one out of like 100,000 people, you know, and maybe she lied to Seth, I don't know. But I know that the first time I went to McDonald's in Switzerland, they sell fair trade coffee. They have a list of all of the common allergens in every single thing on their menu on the back of the paper liner on the tray. Everything was compostable. 75% of the food used to be sold in McDonald's food is grown in Switzerland, and the remaining 25% is grown in Europe, and there's no GMOs. So you tell me whether or not McDonald's wants to like damage the earth, or if they just want to sell you a hamburger. And if you set the rules about what it looks like to sell you a hamburger, if they're going to conform to it or not, because they do it in Europe. You know, like we give away so much power by not holding our politicians accountable to do what's best for everybody and not just do what's easiest. And we let them get away with the fact that they think we don't care.
You've covered a lot of ground. I think I've got time for this question that's come in. Do you think demonstrating works? Is it the best way to try to convince those in power to act? For example, Greta Thunberg's school strikes, climate marches, arrests for blocking pipelines and logging activities.
Yes and no. I think sometimes effective protests can draw attention to an issue that people, there may be somewhere in Canada people who are not aware of the climate emergency. I don't know any, but maybe there are. And maybe the experience of witnessing or having their lives disrupted in some way by the climate protests is the thing that inspires them to want to find out what the heck, okay, so why are 100,000 people gathered on the Georgia Viaduct? Or, and does it change policy? No. So I think there has to, it can't be an either or solution, right? Like you can't have nobody standing up and preaching that the world needs to change, because people do listen to that, but also I don't think it's effective. And this is where I think on the left we kind of like eat our young a little bit, is like never celebrating small victories or saying what's good about a certain measure, and also compromising at the expense of the people who are left out. Right? Like so much of the environmental movement has been centered in middle-class, white ideas of like centering the needs of ecosystems outside of our human existence, and not listening to Black and Indigenous people of color who are experiencing environmental racism and saying, actually, no, my relationship with this earth is like drastically impacted by this environmental disaster that's happening in my river where I fish, or to the moose that I eat. And so not like paying attention to some of the intricacies of like what works and doesn't work, and having the strength of character to stand up and say, you know, the way that this policy has been watered down to compromise is not life-giving to the people that are most affected by it. So I don't know, I think, but we just got to keep trying.
We do. We're getting down to a few minutes, and we have a couple of questions, if we can put ourselves on a timer here.
Yeah.
And
Speed round.
Yep,
Yes.
that's what we do.
Can you share with us some of the ways the United Church is actively trying to achieve environmental justice on Earth and hold our politicians accountable? A hard speed round.
Yeah. We have fossil-free faith initiatives. We're divesting from fossil fuels. Lots of congregation, like we're doing that at the institutional level, but then lots of congregations are doing it as well. We have programs for retrofitting church buildings. There's lots of public education that happens within the church. We participate in UN talks, preach on it a lot. Yeah, those are some things to name a few.
Thank you. This would be a challenge for all of us to keep within time. What is the role of humans' alienation from nature and capitalism's focus on profit in creating the climate crisis? Is not inequality inextricably linked to the climate crisis?
Yeah. When I worked at EcoJustice, Devin Page, who's the executive director there, was my boss, and he challenged me to read a book called Consumed, which I don't remember the author's name at the moment, but it's all about how, like, you know, we get taught this fallacy of the modern economic system as a system of like supply matching demand, right? But that's not actually how things work. We make things and then we manufacture the desire to consume them, which is not supply meeting demand. It's making your demand meet the supply that's existing. And at its heart, I think our system is not actually capitalist in the way that was imagined by Adam Smith and others. It is neo-mercantilist. It's a rebirth of the like rape and pillage colonialist drive of like the conquistadors going and like taking every single mineral out of Latin America. And I think that we don't name that enough. There was a third point I had. I don't know, you'll have to invite me back another time. And I'll
We
think of
will.
it.
Let just to conclude on my part, and then to Olivia, I'm going back to the beginning. We've touched on trust, and we had Seth open, who talked about the importance of mobilization, mass mobilization in recognition of the climate emergency.
Yeah.
He describes, as you know, in some detail, what government needs to do. How can multi-faith, how can the religious community support a mobilization that builds the trust that the public will get behind for the kinds of dramatic decisions we all need to be making these days? What is the, there's a role out there, I think, that's pretty important for leadership, is there not, in the faith community?
Yeah. Well, one, I think we have to put our money where our ethics are. We have to educate our investment managers around what those ethics are and why they're important. I think it's something crazy, like 70% of the world's GDP is like in people's pension funds. I think but more broadly, I think if religious leaders could come together and agree on a campaign, and this is the thing that I think is really compelling about Seth's book, is this idea of like there were propaganda, but like the rallying cries that like pulled Canadians together who were not at all in favor of getting involved in the Second World War at first. But the rallying cries that pulled us together to try and achieve some common goals. Supported the military-industrial complex, but whatever, that part aside. Or to use another equally catastrophic environmental set of goal achieving was Kennedy and the cry to like put a man on the moon within 10 years. Like, and that like infamous story of the, whoever, some big, I don't know if it was the president or the head of the Pentagon or somebody saying to a janitor at NASA, "And what do you do here?" And he said, "Well, I'm helping to put a man on the moon, sir." I feel like if our religious leaders could come together and say, like, do our own 100% campaign or whatever it was that we wanted to like inspire Canada to in terms of addressing or mitigating the climate emergency, if we could come up with our own campaign and inspire people to do that, there's a possibility that we could get people aligned to achieve the impossible, because we've proven ourselves able to do it so much. Like, whoever, QAnon conspiracy around vaccinations aside, whoever thought that we could develop, as fallible or imperfect as it is, a system of vaccinations that could address a coronavirus within a 6-month period. Like 30 years ago, we didn't have the science to do that. That's right. So we have the tools and the skills and the knowledge and the different practices that we need to be able to make a collective difference. We just have to like link arms and trudge towards like the goal that the world that we're trying to create, instead of fighting about like who's got the right way to do it. Maybe all the ways are the right way to do it.
Thank you. Olivia.
I'm very aware of what the clock is telling me, but I still want to return one last time to what you were talking about earlier about, our brains work better when we're hopeful. And faith, double-edged sword, one of the edges is the edge that allows so many of us to feel any kind of hope. And I work with the kids here. I'm a member and a staff member. And when we talk about climate with children, there's all these studies that show that kids who grow up to be climate activists are not people who saw destruction early in their lives. They're people who, as children, saw beauty and loved the world around them. So when we're planning stuff around the environment with kids, we put off any doom and gloom as far as we can until they're as old as we can last them, and just plant seeds and look at trees and think about the beauty. And that's how we attempt to manufacture children who care about the environment. But I wanted to ask you, those inspirational moments, those connections to hope, if you can answer as quickly as possible, where do those live for you?
Well, I'll push back to another question and make a connection about like the importance of like the prophetic voice and disruption and what was the word we just used? Like protest. I think that idea of like the climate activists who, or youth that become climate activists, or ones who are inspired by and had experiences in nature, is very much within that like white middle class paradigm, right? Which is like the world that this world is in. I've seen incredibly brave and resilient and beautiful, brilliant prophetic voices of young people, especially in the United States, who are people of color, that grew up watching their siblings get cancer or asthma because they're the ones directly affected by it. So I really want to push back against that idea of like we have to inspire children with beauty, because that's a very privileged perspective. There are all kinds of children who grow into brilliant prophetic activists because they have seen firsthand being the most marginalized and feeling the impacts of the climate emergency and pollution firsthand. But I think that like that in itself is like we need both, right? Because we need to raise good critical thinkers who are going to say that like both those, like they're not pitted against each other, right? The kid that grew up in West Point Grey and became inspired to be a climate activist because they saw the year that the salal leaves turned copper from getting scorched by the sun is going to be an effective partner to, you know, the young woman in Richmond, California, who grew up just on the outskirts of the oil refineries and learned through community gardening in her high school about environmental racism and stood up to Chevron, right? Like, we need both. So.
Go ahead.
There's a difference in the choices given to different children, and to erase that does a disservice to all of them.
Well, I mean, I think the thing is when you're a child, like showing them the picture of the kid who's got cancer because he grew up next to that oil refinery is so far outside of like their reality. I don't know that children actually, like our brains don't fully develop until we're in our mid-20s, right? So I don't know that they have the cognitive capacity to make that connection. And so if this like comfortable middle class world is the world that the kids that you're working with are growing up in, then yeah, do what works. Like there's no need to like scare them with images that are just going to create cognitive dissonance for them. And I think that that's why. But I don't think it's about like focusing on hope and not the scary parts of it. It's about like guiding them to value the inherent dignity of every person and the rest of the world and that interconnected web of existence in your principles in a way so that when they're older, they can make those connections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much for tonight. I am realizing now I keep talking about the time, but now I really actually have to listen to it. Thank you so much. This has been really wonderful. I think that what is special about this evening in our series is that we are being brought back to remember that these are not separate crises, that it is a privileged point of view to be able to box up each crisis and put it away when you don't want to deal with it. But that all of these issues are converging on all of us together. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because as we recognize the interconnectedness of issues of monetary policy and of poverty and of racism and of the climate catastrophe, we find ways to deal with it together. And thank you so much for that.
You're very welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
You had some housekeeping.
Oh, yes, you're right. Yep. I would have blown right past it. Thanks, Michael. A reminder to watch for the continuation of our series. Our next evening is on February 9th. That's another Wednesday. And it is with Rabbi Hannah Dresner from Or Shalom, the East Van Shul. So please join us for that. There will also be an evaluation available of this evening. I think
it's going to be online, I think, where you can find it.
There will be a slide with an email there. Yep. Yes. Right. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to put my mask on.
That was terrific.